All right, thank you. All right, well, hello, everybody. Great to see everybody. And as mentioned, I'm going to be giving our little introduction from the professor's perspective about teaching D language at university. So just to go ahead and get this started, the main takeaway for those who might watch this later, or for you in the audience, well, you folks don't really have a choice, but you have to sit through here. The main takeaway is using the D language was a significant or substantial improvement to how software engineering was taught from my perspective at the university. And I think other faculty and trainers should take a really close look at the D language and see if they're able to use it as effectively as well. And the why is the rest of this presentation for what made D-Lang so effective. Slides are available for those who might want to take a look at this later as well. Here's a little bit about me. You can read about the abstract that brought you here. But where I really want to take you back is all the way to the spring of 2022, last year, when I start pondering about this question. Because you see, the software engineering course at Northeastern University, where I teach in Boston, is titled Foundations of Software Engineering. And the idea is that this is a course that gets students ready for their first internship or co-op, or for students who have previous experience, it gives them another portfolio piece or more software engineering experience before they go off into the real world. So I'm teaching upper-level undergraduates and master's students primarily. About 85% or so of the students are master's level. And historically, I taught this course in modern C++. Other instructors use whatever languages they want, Java, TypeScript, and so on. And the learning objectives for this course are the following. Now, if you had a university experience like me or others, software engineering might be a sort of trivia course where you learn what is agile. There's one way to teach that. And those things are important, right? Culturally, you need to know about what those things are. And that they're relevant, but this really is a software engineering course where I want to build something. So it's project-based, students are programming, along with learning the team-building skills and human side of engineering. So both equally important, both emphasized, but this is a programming course. And the reality is, with my previous iterations of this course in modern C++, I think I introduced students to a lot of great skills that they'd need to know as engineers. Reflect on my own experience. GitHub, how to debug with GDB, static analysis, code coverage, all these different things. But what I found is the ability to really use C++ as a language for teaching this was a barrier to actually completing a good project. And I'll get into why that is throughout this presentation. And this isn't so much of a language versus language talk. That's not what I mean for this to be. But there's a right tool to use in the right place sometimes. And the reality, what I was finding is the C++ learning curve was very, very steep. Most students were entering this course very excited and motivated to learn C++. They knew there were jobs in gaming or finance or really every field where they'd be using C++. Most of the students coming into this course, however, had no C++ experience, so you can imagine I'm teaching them, built into the course, a crash course of how to learn the language in 4 weeks. Very difficult task to do, as some will know. So we're sort of limited in the dependencies, the libraries. I have a very small curated set of tools that I'm familiar with and can kind of coach students with. Things like the simple fast media library, Catch2 for unit testing, and so on. So throughout this project, students would work in about teams of 4. And what I'd find is I'd have teams where 1 or 2 programmers dominate. Maybe some of the students already knew C++ from prior industry or internship work. And then the rest of the teammates would sort of have to sit back and not be able to make technical contributions to the project. The levels of the C++ being used were so different, because there's so many ways to do things in the language. And that could even form tension on the sort of human side of things in the course that I wanted students to learn how to do, work in teams, help each other, teaching each other, and so on. So the learning curve steepness of the language was a huge issue. Interestingly, though, from this course, the feedback I got from students on my evaluations was exceedingly high. I won awards for this. It was great. Mike's a great teacher. 4.8 out of 5 after teaching this for 3 semesters. That's good news. I get to keep my job. I'm still here. Some subset of the students even got C++ development jobs, which was great. So that sounded like outcomes were being met here, and I should sort of pat myself on the back here. But something wasn't right with the course. Again, teaching C++ is a monumental effort. Teaching anything is monumental effort. Fine, I'll put the work in. That's my job. But proportionally, the efforts that I'm putting into this course are 20+ hours a week, and I've got 3 other courses where I need to do this, and research, activity, family, friends, health, other things that are important as well. And for the students, they're also spending 20+ hours a week, and they've got other courses, family, friends, health, other things to worry about as well. So how can we manage this without students just sort of clawing their way through software engineering in the sense that they're fighting with the language more than actually learning the interesting parts, architecting software, making design decisions and trade-offs where I want them? And again, the issue here with C++ is it just wasn't a great language. I just wasn't finding that fit that I wanted in the course. I wanted to teach engineering skills. So students would be in high stress mode, frantically trying to relearn material as I'm reteaching it, and we spend lots and lots of time debugging to get them to the finish line. And when I went back to the original reason why I was using C++, and I was sort of the odd person out from what other instructors were doing, I'd noticed this trend where lots of universities weren't using C++ anymore. Again, maybe it was out of trend, maybe there are other things to do, but that kind of gave me encouragement to try something else. And again, I thought C++ was a good idea because my professional background of what I had used in the language, I had experience, and so forth. But I really had to think about this. So changes needed to be made with this course. And I had some amount of guilt abandoning C++ here. Again, I've given talks, was sort of known for C++. Students were excited I would be teaching it. And it seemed reasonable to just keep clawing my way through this and say, maybe I'll get better. The first semester you teach a course, there's some rough edges. The second time, it gets a little bit smoother. But by the third time, you kind of have a course laid out over a semester. That's sort of a secret, how things work from my end. But again, the reality that I noticed was things weren't clicking here. I wasn't able to get students to the level where I thought they should. And I'm not talking about my star students, I'm talking about everybody, the students who are struggling and that I really need to train to be good engineers. So moving us from the spring of 2022, in the summer, in between here, I come speak at DConf, and I reveal that I'm using the D language in a programming language agnostic course on ray tracers from last year. So you could use whatever language you want, but I'm using D-Lang, and I'm really enjoying it for this class. As well as I find my other personal projects in Python were all being converted to the D language. So there was something here where I was just having fun using the language. It scaled well, and it was very fun to use. So in the fall of 2022, as time moves on, we got some visitors at Northeastern University. See if we recognize one here. I've got to have Ali in every presentation here. So Ali and Stephen show up to Northeastern University, and we had a really enthusiastic group of students come and listen about an introduction to the D programming language. Faculty as well listening in. And this encouraged me that students would be really responsive to perhaps a new language for software engineering. They saw the value in the language. And I'm sort of ruminating on the D programming language. So don't have to read the long list now, but these are the things that I'm thinking about before committing to a new programming language. It's a big decision. But as I looked at the D ecosystem, I saw the multiple compilers, I saw the package manager, the profiler, code coverage, all these tools built into the ecosystem at the start. Now, of course, they have their rough edges in some places, but the idea that this was all here and all thought about, again, emphasized that D is a language for software engineering, building real software. And importantly, and this was with Ali's visit and Stephen and others, D was industry proven here. And that was really important, especially for Northeastern University where I was, because our students are very pragmatic. They all have to get some sort of internship or co-op. That's part of our program. So they're really here to land a job as a software engineer. So they want to be using something that, again, teaches them pragmatic skills. So I also had some other encouragement from Chuck Allison, who taught at Utah Valley University, amongst other places, and is a speaker here at DConf many years ago. I believe he's recently retired from teaching, but he had been using the D language as well, and gave many wonderful talks, again listing many reasons why folks like using D, and many of the features that make it great. And I found some other examples of folks dabbling in the D language, and we're going to find out from others of you today in various universities who are using D as well. And then it was also critical along this process to identify some good free resources to be able to teach the students. So again, Ali's book was critical in this, and we can't underestimate even just having the detour on the web page how important this is. It would become a fundamental part of students learning and ramping up on the language very quickly. So finally, some final inspiration here, and this comes again from Ali's book, from Andrei Alexandrescu. He's got this quote here, saying, "I've long suspected D is a good first programming language to learn, and it exposes its users to a variety of concepts, systems, functional, object-oriented, generic, generative, candidly and without pretense." And then Ali writes very well in his book. I really resonated with this statement, and it's something that I took to heart as far as my own personal experience using D, and that I think it's just a really great language. So I know I'm preaching to an audience here of D developers, but part of the secret is this talk's for all the faculty who are going to watch this later. But I really think the D programming language, the unique thing and one of its superpowers is its potential to scale throughout a curriculum. Meaning I could probably teach this in a CS1 class, but I think I could also use this language to teach systems and operating systems and graphics. And that can be very valuable to be working in one of those language in multiple paradigms, again, as we know in this audience. So these final realizations started to come together. And then from fall of 2022, we get to spring semester of 2023. And at this point, I've committed to the D programming language for software engineering. I'm convinced. And so it begins. So on the first day of class, on one of my first slides, I'm introducing the D programming language to my course. And I asked my students, how many of you have ever heard of the D programming language? And there were maybe one or two hands that rose up. Our school is known for programming languages, actually. And then there were a few others who looked at my website ahead of time and they said, oh yeah, I looked at the D language, I hadn't heard of it, looks neat, and so on. But this was about 110 students or so. And then I asked my students, how many of you have heard of C++? And then, a bunch of students raised their hands. Of course they have. And many were taking the course with me because I said, oh yeah, I want to learn C++, I haven't learned that yet, that'll be interesting. So then, of course, I proceed further here. And on the next slide, I tell my students, you're going to be learning not C++ in this class for software engineering, but the 46th most popular language, D-Lang. I can see my students here, their hearts are pounding. What? So the language that not many students have heard of. And of course, I told you, my students are very pragmatic. They're at university to get a job. Right? They're very reasonable about that. That's a good reason to go to university, to get trained and land in industry. So was I nervous at this point? I was being honest with what we had here. And again, put yourself in the seat of a student whenever you make these decisions and say, I'm going to teach you something that when you go on Indeed.com or LinkedIn or looking for a job, you don't see D language listed usually. So again, was I nervous to use D language for the software engineering course? And I had to think about this for a little bit and be honest. My answer is still no. And the reason why is, again, I just take the responsibility of being a teacher very, very serious, because you have to choose the right job, or the right tool for the right job, rather. That's just being a good engineer in my mind. And I had, again, as I explained, saw that C++ wasn't working. Maybe other languages would have worked, maybe, but I'm convinced that D language is the best. So again, I believe that the D language unlocked lots of interesting opportunities, one for its ease of getting students ramped up, and while it's not a perfect language, it had enough interesting things here. Even just merely having @safe brings lots of interesting discussions. Well, what's safe code? Or that we have pointers. Well, when should I use them? When should I not use them? Or the different paradigms. Or, what can I do at compile time versus runtime? All these interesting things that we get to talk about and where to use them in software engineering. And just as an aside, I checked for this presentation. We're now up to 33rd for whatever this metric is out of 46. So we're moving on up here. But again, choosing a tool, jokes aside, it's not about being a popularity contest. There's famous stories I think we all know of folks choosing languages that give them the competitive advantage. So choose the right tool. So getting into the course and the curriculum and some of the assignments, just a brief overview. The way the course is structured is it's a semester-long course split in half, 7 weeks roughly. Students are working independently on assignments, learning the D language from the tour, building data structures, so some things they had done in other languages, but now they got to see it in the sort of D language way. Some other critical skills like debugging, profiling, understanding the software process, using tools like Dub, programming patterns, and so on. That's the first 7 or so weeks. And then the next 7 weeks are working on a project. So a larger project, broken down into milestones, but students are pretty much up to their own schedule setting for how they complete the project over those 7 weeks. And again, these were things inspired by my own work experience. So roughly speaking, and folks can check out my website, again, if you're interested in teaching or seeing the examples I use, but here's the 7 weeks where students are just ramping up on the D programming language, learning about different paradigms, some libraries, and again, tools that you would learn in software engineering. The next 7 to 8 weeks, again, we're in project mode, continuing to learn various tools, some specific to the D ecosystem, things like Dub, DScanner, DFormat for various analyses, and so on. But that's the idea during the project phase. We get to learn some other critical things like profiling, debugging, stuff you would expect or want somebody to know working for your company. So you'll see more about the projects. I'll let them explain what it's about, but it's based off of a real company that was acquired successfully, a startup, and something that I thought students could actually build. And as we learned from the folks at Eucora at our keynote, motivation's everything. So I thought, again, building something real is great. Where did the students struggle and excel from my perspective? So throughout the semester, there were initial struggles with the D language, finding specific documentation, maybe some of the specific libraries that we had to figure out. So that was something that I had to work a little bit to curate and see which libraries and such are actively maintained, and that's where we're going to focus. There were, of course, some difficulties working across Mac, Intel-based versus Apple Silicon, Linux, and Windows, and so on. I actually think this is a really good part of software engineering, having students with different platforms go through that process. And as we've learned from the Hapreem engine, this is difficult, right? Getting set up on different platforms. But as an instructor, again, you kind of pick and choose where the stresses are going to be for this. But it involved interesting trade-offs of who could use LLDB versus GDB, depending on platforms and so on. And there were some initial difficulties getting set up with IDEs. Most students like using VS Code or IntelliJ. I just use Vim, so we had to sort of figure some of those things out. Again, first iteration of a course, you're going to run into some of these things. Secondly, there were struggles that were sort of natural in the sense of, this is a software engineering course, and you might not know some of these things, learning new tools, how you get organized as a team, and so on. So those come with the course no matter what language you actually choose. And the second point here were struggles on relying on documentation or even sometimes the language spec to pick up knowledge. And this is a reasonably hard skill to pick up. I mean, this is something you do as a software engineer when you're building something that doesn't exist. So whether or not that's a reasonable expectation for a student to have, again, there is difficulty there. But again, as somebody pushing my students a little bit, I think it's a great skill to go through that effort. And the reality is, as I was watching some of these struggles here with my students, and I believe I never did. I told myself I never would. Because again, to a student, it doesn't matter, but I never told them, as far as I know, you folks can correct me, I never said, you're going to experience these same pain points whether you're using Java or C++ or whatever it is. But again, you can't tell someone that when you're teaching a class. You're the oracle who knows everything and should set up the course. So there will be improvements in the fall. You can look out for them. Of course, things will get refined in assignments and so on, so hopefully there will be some follow-through on this in another form of talk or something. But it inspired me to continue doing more and more videos, so there will be more D-language resources in that form. But I really encourage the D community to, again, just turn the camera on and record what you're doing. Even if you think it's boring, if you have no ideas of what to do for the hackathon later, just turn your camera on, code, even if you're not saying anything, for 30 minutes and just, produce something interesting, okay? Show a D idiom that could be useful to somebody. I'm also planning on adding more resources. Mike Parker wrote a wonderful book, which I've been reading through, Learning D, with lots of project-based examples, so that's been great. And then just a heads up, or ahead of time, thank you to all the D community members who have during the semester responded with bug fixes, continuing to support LDC, GDC, fixing bug reports. That can be really thankless work, but it smooths out the course for folks like me every semester as time passes on. So again, more on the sort of course postmortem here. Some things that did and did not matter in choosing the D language. Having RDMD for quick prototyping, man, that was a magic moment I felt like when I showed students, here's the language we're going to be doing. I just type RDMD in a file, and they're like, wait, this is just like Python. We know Python. Python's great. And that mattered a lot for sort of selling the productivity of the language. I thought that was brilliant. D had better error messages, so I spent much less time debugging in this course, so amazing. D has a garbage collector. I don't know how many forum posts that I look at on the World Wide Web that says, D has a garbage collector. This is why this isn't great. No student, to my knowledge, voiced this as a bad thing. They loved it, and it was amazing for me as well to just handle memory allocation. Of course, early on, for my own due diligence, I showed them, yeah, you can malloc and free. Just like everything, there's a trade-off. Choose which strategy you want. There are many. So I love that. D also taught students to work with dependencies. So whether these were C libraries, and you'll hear about what libraries we used exactly, but again, I think this is a really important and realistic part of software engineering, having interop between two different languages and how you sort of manage crossing boundaries between different languages. And then finally, students had to do networking in a project without prior networking course that they had taken, or most hadn't taken a networking course. And this was great because, again, D has most of the common things that you would want, at least from my perspective, things like a socket library, JSON, working with CSV, zipping files, etc. So it made it easy to just get started and play and experiment. And I think it also taught the skill that sometimes as an engineer, you just learn stuff as you go, right? That's the reality. So again, it took great patience, watching this course. And I think it was, with this group, and this is one of the all-star teams, I'll say. But they came to me around week 11 or 12 in the semester, and they were showing me their project and things that they were struggling with. And I was looking at them, I was going, okay, we'll fix this. But I was looking at it as like, and I didn't tell you guys this, but it's like, they're probably done 2 weeks early, but I can't tell them that. And this was true for pretty much all the D language projects that I had seen. So you can read this bolded point here, that the worst project, if I sort of go on a grading scale, just objectively, in the D language was on par or better than the best projects from the previous 3 semesters done in C++. So I was quite impressed, quite convinced, and that's the reason I'm going to keep using D into the fall and beyond. So that was pretty convincing and pretty neat. So as mentioned, I'll continue using DLang at university. I think it can scale throughout the curriculum. I'd encourage other instructors to take a look at D language and its potential, because I think it's a complete package for software engineering. It's got all the built-in tools and stuff, and you can read through here. Advice to other faculty or trainers who are thinking about adopting this tool, or maybe inside of your company if you're trying to get buy-in for projects, give folks notice on the switch so they know. Know your university or your company culture. I had faculty backing me saying learning a new language is an asset. It's something you do in the university. And of course, you can reach out to me if you're considering this. And I think there's going to be real value in the future here, working with folks at DCOMP, of academia and industry combining here. We've got 110 students who know DLang since the last spring semester. 60 more great ones are going to be generated, so keep an eye out. So with that, I'm going to transition into the next presentation. I'll hold my questions till the end. But I've asked this group to come give their honest experience. That's all I've asked them to do about using the D language, and they'll show you their project. And that's it from me.
So, hi everyone, I'm Andrew Briasco-Stewart. This is going to be the student version of Mike's talk. We're going to talk about D and how we went about learning it, our experiences with it, and then a bit about the project that we did while there. These are your guides for today in appearance order. So I'm going to talk about the intro, initial reactions, learning D, some of the exciting features we found through learning. Elizabeth is going to talk about program overview, leveraging Dub, and then Steven's also going to talk about Dub and start the project conclusions, and then Ben will take it off for what did we miss out going forward and also conclusions. So Mike went over this pretty much, but we are 3 undergraduates, 1 graduate. This was our first semester, so spring 23, so when we took the course in D. This was our first experience with D. So we are very new at this. We had around 3.5 months, so 14 weeks of D experience when we wrote this. So there are going to be mistakes. Feel free to point them out to us after the talk. We're happy to learn and grow from it, but there will be mistakes. So how did we go about learning D, and what were our initial reactions to it? It was just before the start of the semester, I think, we found out we were going to be learning in D, so some of us went off, did some initial research to it. We did some Google searching. Mike provided some links to a couple of the learning resources. We were hesitant. We had never heard of it, and we couldn't really find much about it online, which is not a good sign for starting a course, but I think it was good to have a limited scope because it encourages students to do searching, and you need those skills for becoming a good software engineer. We also saw the community was small, which was another hesitation. So what does learning from D look like for an average programmer? By far, our favorite resource was the Tor. It basically showed us how, coming from another programming language, the syntax is in D. Like, how do you take your experience from there and convert it to writing in D with very nice, concrete examples, understandable text, pretty much everything initial that we had questions on, we could go to the Tor and do it. So here's some examples. So the inline unit tests, really nice. You don't have to do a library. It's just write a unit test block, and then you can test them. You write some assert statements. Uniform function call syntax is great. You don't need to learn like 3 different ways to call a function. It's the same thing every time. Contract programming as well is really nice so that you can check stuff, make sure you're not doing anything wrong. Beyond the Tor, these were pretty much the resources that we went to. So the forums for very specific questions, or I'm having a bug, let me go search it. One of the downsides of the forum, though, is that you can find out-of-date stuff on there. So you have to pay attention, because not everything there will work after, if it's from 10 years ago. The textbook, really good for in-depth resources. So I know Ben used it a lot for the networking portion, because it had really detailed stuff for that. Video tutorials. For beginner stuff, or if you're unfamiliar to an aspect of programming, having someone walk you through it would be very helpful. And then, of course, the assignments. So, of course, the best way to learn D is to program in it. So these are some of our early programs. We've got, on the upper left, we've got a deck implementation. The bottom one is a builder design pattern. So we all had to do a different design pattern in D. One of us did builder. Top right is your obligatory input-output terminal guessing game. I think that's the entire code for it in D, which is really nice. After learning it initially, these were sort of our takeaways. These were what we were excited about. And we were excited at this point, because D seemed really approachable. We were truly gaining an understanding of it. Garbage collection is really nice, because you don't have to worry about memory management. Especially if you're new, it's great because you don't have to learn it. And if you know it already, you still don't have to use it. It's really nice. Memory safety is somewhat challenging, just because from either end of the spectrum, you still have to, there is some syntactic stuff you have to learn or know not to use. It is nice to have the different paradigms for programming, just because no matter what program you're coming from, D has something for you, something familiar for you to use. C interrupting is really nice just to have, because it's a nice fallback. And then localized imports and mix-ins, we didn't use that much, but they seem very powerful to us at the time. So now I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth, and she's going to talk about our project.
Having the experience established on the previous slides, we learned the broad scope about the D language. With that knowledge, we were able to create an actual D project, which was very exciting. I will be going over our project overview, our journey to our MVP, or minimum viable product with respect to creating our user interface, and a brief overview of our networking. Our project assignment was to create a desktop application in D where users in different locations could collaboratively paint. The video that you see on the slide is a short demo of our application, just so you can get a gist of what I'm talking about going forward. Our application had to be networked and updated in real time. We included special features such as brush type, brush size, and brush color. Users had the ability to save a PNG file of their whiteboard, and we also included an undo feature and a chat feature. To achieve our project objectives, we worked in roughly 1 to 2 week sprints and intermittently checked in with our project manager, who was a TA. At first, we focused our attention on creating our MVP, which I will talk about on the next slide, before we dove into all those special features I just mentioned. Overall, we found that D was a great language to create this project in, and it was relatively easy to use. When it came time to building our MVP, we went back to what was familiar and tried out the graphics library SDL, or Simple Direct Media Layer, which we had used in a prior homework assignment. Our MVP, as seen on the screen, is a single-person blank canvas for basic drawing. While SDL was working fantastically, we wanted to incorporate more robust UI features, which GTKD provided right out of the box. Originally, we wanted to use SDL and GTKD combined, specifically using SDL for our drawing portion and GTKD for the rest of the UI. However, we ran into issues, and we were not able to figure out how to combine an SDL window with GTKD on Macs. We think that might have been due to some incompatibility issues. Since I had done some experimentation on my own using GTKD to create a whiteboard and a user interface, since I knew we were going to use it in some capacity, and due to the fact that most of us were using Macs, we decided to drop SDL. GTKD is a wrapper for GTK Plus, which is a graphical user interface toolkit. We liked GTKD because it's component-based and it fits in with the object-oriented approach that we were taking. GTKD also has a plethora of built-in UI widgets for us to use, and those were very helpful when it came time to creating our UI. Once we had our UI, sort of pretty much in place, it was time to focus our attention on the networking portion of our project. D and its lower level D and the wrappers and its wrappers for lower level networking structures made networking fairly easy for us. When it came time to picking our networking architecture, we went back and forth between peer-to-peer and client-server. In the end, to try to keep things as simple as possible, and due to time constraints with the class, we went with client-server. For our client, the networking portion was single-threaded, and we did that so our GUI could focus on its own tasks like rendering the whiteboard and the chat. As for our server, we wanted that to be fast. However, since we were only supporting a limited number of users, less than 20 concurrent users to be exact, we didn't feel the need to really mess around with multi-threading. So instead, we went with D's socket set class, which really helped us manage connections and packet resolution. Here is a code snippet, or code snippets, from our client portion of our project. Through simple socket reception and message passing, we were able to create good separation of concerns and get efficient enough networking code for our project. Here is a code snippet from our server side of our project. This is just as simple as the client side, and it shows that it's relying on the socket set in D. And on that note, I'm going to pass it off to our last two speakers, who are going to talk about how D specifically impacted our project development and go into D pros and cons and our final conclusions. Thank you.
I'm going to start off by presenting our CI/CD setup and then go into some conclusions, mainly things to improve. Then Ben will talk about what we really enjoyed about the language. So given that this was a software development class, issue number one was good coding practices. We wanted to set up on day one, a system so that we weren't going to be committing spaghetti code, and we could kind of enforce some quality on our code as we went through the process. So we looked at all the things the pros have. What do we need for a good CI/CD setup? We wanted it to automatically format the code, run unit tests, generate coverage and coverage percentages so we could enforce those, generate DDoCs, and then preferably generate deliverables cross-platform because I was on Windows and everyone else is on Mac. So yeah, that was a priority for us. So how did we achieve that? We ended up separating our project into two separate Dub submodules. We had one for the client and one for the server, and then if we needed files across one or the other, we'd import it one little module at a time instead of the entire thing. And that just kept the code bases a little bit separate. If something happened to one with a dependency, we didn't need to deal with that on the other. And then unit testing, we used unit threaded, kind of the go-to, and that was awesome for multi-threading our tests. And the syntax was super simple. We really enjoyed working with unit threaded. So what ended up working and what didn't from a CI/CD perspective? The code formatting, super easy with dformat. Unit tests, that was great with unit threaded. Code coverage, that was a little bit difficult. So I'll show in a moment, but all of the Dub libraries that were created for that, that are currently up there, don't combine. It's really easy to generate coverage for one file, but it was difficult to combine them and get one percentage. So we ended up writing our own script, which worked really well in theory, but in practice it broke, as we were developing really quickly. So we didn't end up getting the coverage that we really wanted. Then generating docs, that was really easy. We used the OG DDocs and then transferred to Harvard Mod, which was a really nice UI upgrade for that. And then as far as generating cross-platform deliverables, we kind of had to give that up for multiple reasons. One, dependencies. GTK-D really was having issues with Windows and version compatibility in the DLL files and things like that. And we ran out of GitHub Actions credits in like the first week or couple days. And then Mike, goes on Piazza and he's like, guys, we have no more GitHub credits. Stop testing 3 platforms. Just kidding. Okay, so getting into the conclusions of working with D and how that worked for us. I want to preface this by saying overall it was a really enjoyable experience. I found the D syntax and just the whole experience to be more expressive than maybe other languages, and error messages are just amazing in this language. But Ben will talk about all of those things in a moment. I want to talk about the room for improvement. And a lot of this has to do with documentation and tutorials, things that are not as cool, I guess, to a language design community. But okay, I'll start off with Dub. So Dub was awesome, from package management. That was super easy. It helped us make up more professional projects, separating client and server. What it didn't do great with was dub.json documentation was tough. The dub docs, this page was the bane of Andrew and my existence. We spent a lot of hours on this page, and it does a lot of things well. It describes the syntax pretty well, and then you can find production code examples which are pretty good, but it's a little more difficult to find things in the middle, like video tutorials or even just blogs on how you would use these things, that aren't production code per se, and that made it a little bit harder to kind of wade through and take a little bit more time. And then the class and module system. This is one example of us needing probably more tutorials. We had the syntax completely wrong until halfway through our project, and then we discovered that it was wrong and we fixed it, and it was much faster. But that was just an example of us tripping over some syntax where maybe a blog could have helped us figure it out faster. And then learning the GTK-D library. This is an example of a place where there's a C library and then it's been kind of ported to D, but the D documentation doesn't quite keep up with the actual library. So we had to use the C documentation to learn how to use the library, which is fine and it worked, but it definitely took a little more time, and it would be so awesome if there were native D docs that kept up with the updates regularly and everything. Okay, this is what I was talking about earlier, and of course, being a small community, this is it's going to be something that happens. And actually, this kind of behooved us, but the lack of tooling. There aren't as many. This isn't like Python and pip where there's a library for absolutely everything. We found places where you have to kind of write your own tool if you want it, and if you know of a good coverage aggregation tool, just like shout it out or come up to us after the meeting. But this is one example of a place where it would have been nice to have a tool and we had to make our own. You can see that this is just the Dub list of all the packages, and this, the latest one was updated in 2021 and just didn't quite work the way we expected. But actually that was kind of nice for a software development class because it makes you take for granted tools in other languages, and it made us think about our tooling more, which was kind of helpful. So I'll pass it off to Ben to talk about what did we love.
Throughout this presentation, we've kind of tried to take you on a journey of how we've learned the language. Andrew talked, about how we sort of go from zero to some initial knowledge. Elizabeth spoke to how we went through implementing our project, and Stephen, spoke to sort of how we're setting up our project so that we can have an effective production environment. And throughout that, we're sort of at the point now where we're looking back on the language and looking back at our experience in learning the language, and we're asking ourselves the question of how much of the language did we actually get to, and what did we actually touch? So we got to a lot of the features that we wanted to sort of do at the beginning that we experienced through the tour. There's a broad list here. I won't go through all of them, but there were several of the features that really, from a beginner standpoint, elevated D and made D very easy to use and promoted good design practices for us. So the first of that list is message passing. This simplified the code dramatically for us. So for D as a language to provide both robust message passing support and also really focus in on message passing as the preferred concurrency paradigm or a preferred concurrency paradigm, it allowed us to implement our networking incredibly quickly, maintain simple to reason about threads, and promote safe code. So this was really fantastic, got great separation of concern, and also we recognize here that while D does support more classical data sharing concurrency programs through synchronized and shared and stuff like that, the message passing was just so simple and so effective. Ali's book had a great, I think chapter 13 had a great intro on exactly how message passing is used in D, and it really enabled us to scale. So message passing was absolutely fantastic, and we didn't have to worry about any deadlocks and hungry philosophers from classical data sharing. With respect to sort of the ecosystem, while there were some roadblocks for us getting Dub up and running, when Dub was up and running, it was absolutely fantastic. Gone are the sort of technical debt of CMake. You can do all of the CI/CD and testing that you need. And building, and all of that is sort of abstracted away from a beginner user to really sort of allow you to just write code and have it run or have it fail and tell you what's wrong. So it was absolutely fantastic. It was great for our package management, great for the CI/CD utilities. It was really flexible, and when we got it configured correctly, it was very, very simple. So Dub was absolutely fantastic. And of course, it goes without saying, from a beginner standpoint, the memory management, garbage collection, and all of that being built in and turned on by default is absolutely fantastic. We have the flexibility to turn off garbage collection and sort of explore that when we want to, but being able to rely on collection and non-manual memory management is almost a necessity for beginners, and personally, when writing code, it allows me to relax a little bit. And really, again, in terms of making things simple for a beginner user, I think Robert mentioned it yesterday with respect to other languages, Python being one. It's not a concern for people just looking to adopt a language. They don't want to deal with the overhead of having to manually manage memory. So that being said, there was a bunch of stuff in D that we didn't really get to, and a lot of that is because, like Stephen mentioned, there's two main forms of sort of resources into how to use them. And that's the DTOR and the language spec, and that's production code, open source repos, and stuff like that. So one thing that we're pretty bummed about is we didn't do a whole bunch of function attributes and really do anything with trusted system, et cetera, things that D sort of purports as a main marketing standpoint. These to us just weren't necessary. We could write code and not have to worry about them, and our code would work and compile. And there was no real incentive for us to learn why we should use them and why we should incorporate them as good coding practices into our D code, because there was nothing other than just production code for us to look at. There was no reasoning why behind these things were important outside of what they do in the documentation and the spec, and whatever the reasoning is for merging them into the language on pull requests. We didn't really touch mix-ins. Again, these were pretty powerful, but our use case was simple enough that we didn't go into them. One thing that we loved is we didn't have to use C-style addresses and pointers. We did pretty much everything that we needed to do for that through ref and out. So again, going back to Robert's talk yesterday, we kept it really simple, and that enabled us to stop worrying about these things that are classic pitfalls in a language with direct memory access like C. And then moving on to some other less important things like local imports and templates, we weren't really implementing a use case where those are necessary or commonly used, so we didn't touch those. And before coming here, I had no idea what DIP 1000 is, so didn't touch whatever's in that. And honestly, kind of glad about that. So to wrap up, D is an incredibly valuable learning language. It exposes all of the right things at the right time to you. You can go and really learn the language at your own pace and explore into the sort of computer programming space as much as you want and at your own pace, but what's holding the language back is complexity through inconsistency and lack of clarity, both in documentation and examples. So the language and the ecosystem themselves, we think are fantastic. They're very, very encouraging. But the fact that the base level documentation is the syntax transfer from other languages, and then the next jump is either the language spec or open source repositories, which are very helpful for understanding how code works, but not necessarily why you should implement code in certain ways or follow certain programming practices, or really learning the ins and outs of the D language without being embedded in the ecosystem. That was a bit of a challenge, and we think it makes the entry to switching to D a little bit too high for a casual programmer unless they have a specific reason why they want to learn D already. So moving forward, the ways to sort of address that are to publish these beginner level examples and toy programs outside of a project context, sort of the Medium article, like, basically explain why we do things the way that we do. And you can do that by writing articles that are not bound by the forums. And then another thing is to really update the documentation so that, these beginner students, they don't have to go to an open source repository and really dig into what the code is actually doing. They can just read the documentation and figure it out. And then finally, just keep programming in D. That's obviously the best way, is to keep the ecosystem alive. Eventually more people will come. And that is pretty much our talk. If you want the code for our project, maybe we can take a drink every time you find a bug at BeerConf tonight. It's right here. And with that, any questions for any of us?
Less of a question, more of a note. Going back to the coverage projects, I think you overestimate the complexity of the coverage format. These projects are probably not, they're not unmaintained, they just didn't need maintenance.
I think that's definitely correct. After I went through and tried every single one of those, and you're right. The level of it not working varies from like light, like total breaking, like doesn't work at all, to just generated the output and it was like just a little bit funky, but not in a way that was like reliably, scriptable or something like that. So I think you're right about that.
I really enjoyed this. It's really a wonderful work that you students are doing, and congratulations to Mike for really making a great course. And my question to Mike is, are you recording your class lectures so that they can be put up on YouTube? Because it sounds to me like, your lectures just sound like they're going to be great and they should be recorded and put on YouTube.
Yeah, so they are recorded, everything. Right now they're unlisted. I'm kind of waiting for iteration 2 or 3 before I promote them widely, but folks can find them if they look at my website and Foundations of Software Engineering.
Okay, so, a big thank you from me for doing all this.
Yep,
And
thank you.
to your students for great presentations.
We have a online question from Ricky to the students. Were the resources that you had available to you enough to prevent you needing to reach out to the community at large, such as Discord and IRC, for help? If not, what resources did you find missing?
Yeah, so personally, I think they were definitely enough. I never had to post on the forums or reach out in the Discord. But I think with that comes sort of like a head down mindset. I personally would much rather figure the thing out on my own and experience, sort of the debugging aspect of it and come to a resolution, see if I can do that quickly before reaching out to someone. So there were definitely times when the resources were a little bit lacking, but it wasn't anything that couldn't be figured out quickly.
A question about which type of tutorial would be most preferable to you or other students, like, would you prefer something like a YouTube video or a small Medium article where you can copy and paste the text? For you, what is the most digestible and how can we help?
I think I'll take this first. I know Elizabeth has some good perspective on this as well. I'll mention it briefly, but the GTK decoding blog, I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but it's like a bunch of code snippets written in GTKD that sort of explore the API. So that was incredibly helpful when we were writing our UI, just because it gives examples of how D interops with the API when the documentation wasn't always, the best. So I think it's less so, from my perspective, I think it's less so copy and paste code type of tutorials. I think it's more so, you can Google Python, Python project name, and you'll get a Medium article or a Geeks for Geeks that has a 20-page, here's how I implemented this whole entire project in Python, right? And you can find that for any size project and any really topic. So I think it's more, for me, it's more so finding the articles that have code and explain what the code is doing, but also explaining the why aspect behind it, because the syntax and all that stuff, that's available in the documentation. You can see how the code is used in open source repos. It's the insight behind why we're developing that way that's really valuable, and really when you're a beginner, you want to learn.
Yeah. My personal favorite is Medium articles. I love those. If there was like here's my reasonably complicated CI/CD setup in, for my D-Lang project, here's like my dub.json, here's what libraries I'm using, and here's the, the things I'm trying to do and the builds I'm targeting. That would be like the coolest thing in the world. And I imagine they're probably easier to make than YouTube videos. I don't know, I haven't made a lot of that content, but I love Medium articles and things like that.
As I was creating the UI, I made extensive use, as Ben said, with that GTKD coding blog. I loved the tutorials, demos, and like samples that it provided. With that being said, it might have been better if we had more than one blog to look at, just to get different perspectives. So that would have been very helpful. And then as for like different types of mediums for how we learn, I personally really enjoyed Mike's YouTube videos. I watched the ones that he had out before the class started, and then as the semester went on, I followed along with his videos, and I found that to be extremely helpful. And then, as he was my teacher, I was able to ask him questions after class relating to his videos. So I found that extremely helpful as well.
For me, probably just coding examples. So like a small toy program, but then words alongside it that sort of step you through, this is why we do it this way. This is the syntax that's the best because it's either cleanest, most understandable. Also, like if you dub.json, like here's the JSON, here's what each line does in the context of the project. For me, yeah.
A question on the course structure. It was interesting to see that testing was quite far down on your assignments after even debugging and dub. Is that because of the tooling order, or was it because of the type of testing you're doing, or logistically? I mean,
yeah, I think unit test blocks were pushed up quite early, actually. So just showing that form, but doing other more like behavioral-driven testing and advanced strategies is pushed down. My technique usually for these courses, and I'm always flipping the order, thinking I found a better way, is usually push debugging as early as possible. And as long as I have that, that's usually their priority. I think in assignment 2 we were writing unit tests, hopefully, but yeah, I'd be curious if folks have other ideas for how to arrange things. But yeah, I think it was week 7 or so.
Having learnt D through this semester, just ask the obvious question. Do you think that learning D has given you the tools to be a better programmer in another language?
I would say so, yes. The first language you learn is always like the one you learn the most from, but that's just because you learn about programming languages. But with each successive language, you do learn something more. You learn at least one new syntax, you learn at least one new way to sort of tell the computer how to do stuff. And so I think D has quite a lot that I learned, even with it not being my first program.
I have 2 questions, actually. The first one is, what are the programming languages that you learned before learning D? And would you consider using D in the future for your project, or taking a job in D language?
Okay. I think we all C++? Okay, Elizabeth hasn't. Ben, Stephen, and I think C++. I knew Python. Elizabeth, oh, we both knew Java and C. So the popular, oh, you knew R? Oh, I didn't know that. The popular ones. And then would I use it in the future? Yes. I think as Mike is doing, like, it's a popular alternative to Python, just because RDMD is so nice. I think I have started doing some scripts in D instead of Python, just because it's nice to sort of keep the experience with practice.
I also like D. I am in more of the embedded space though, and I looked at embedded D tool chains after, learning in D, and I didn't see anything that really jumped out to me. So maybe that's something I have to take on. Hopefully not. But yeah, so for me, I'd love to if the ecosystem could develop more.
I would also definitely use D in a job. Although clearly it's the tools and the build targets are dependent, whether they exist or not.
Yeah, I too would use it again. I really liked. I'm biased towards Java a little because that was my first coding or programming language besides Scratch. So I like how it has the features of Java and like C, for example. And it's object-oriented and all that stuff. And yeah, so I would definitely use it again and recommend it to others.
Oh, that's great news. And that's all the time we have for the questions there. So thank you, everyone.